All right, is November the 13th, 2008, recorded at the Lackawanna Library. And if you could please state your name.
Tim O'Shei.
Tim, what's your date of birth?
9/24/43.
Where were you born, Tim?
In Buffalo, on the east side of Buffalo.
Okay. And I'll leave it to you.
Okay, I started at Bethlehem Steel, ironically, on April Fool's Day, 1963. What I had to do to work in the office was to take a typing exam. And I did have 2 years of typing at time in high school. But unfortunately, we learned on electric typewriters. And when I took the exam at Bethlehem, it was on a manual typewriter. And they put you in a room and they give you a sheet of paper to copy. And they give you 5 minutes. And I was 18 and a half years old, I guess. I dropped it on the floor. I was making a million mistakes because I'm hitting the keys and they wouldn't go down. And I think I owed them words when we finished. And didn't do well. But because my father works in the office at Bethlehem and my brother, a little nepotism as usual, they pulled some strings and they allowed me to get hired, not as a typist, but in what they call the tube room. It was a pneumatic tube system in a strip mill, which is 7-gate, which had the hot mill, the cold mill, and all the strip steel that they use in automotive. And I was working in the pneumatic tube room, which sent mail all over the plant, from the main office to the little front office, they called it. It's no longer there. They tore it down. It was a brick building that housed the superintendent of the strip mill and all his assistants, and upstairs was the tube room. And what I did there, in addition to just mailing the letters and interplant material out, was I ran a multilith machine, which is like an offset printer, like you see in the newsrooms, these gigantic printers. This was a smaller version. They called it was the Addressograph Multilith Company. And I'd run off the orders for the entire plant, bar mill, structural, all the other mills. And at the end of the day, you'd have to keep a count on the counter, and they'd see how many you ran, and I did pretty well. And I was working 1 to 9, which for a single young guy was the best hours you could possibly work in your life. But that only lasted about 3 months, because at that time, business was going so well that they had to hire somebody else to keep up with the work. So I went on 3 to 11:30, and they hired a woman, to work days. And in those days, she got hired as what you would call a C clerk. They had categories A, B, and C, A being the highest, B second, C the lowest. And Bethlehem being a problem company at that time with discrimination and so forth rearing its head, all women got hired as C clerks and all men got hired as B clerks. So we were earning somewhat, I don't know, maybe at that time, I was making $93.50 a week in 1963. I was getting paid every other week. It was bi-weekly pay. And she was probably making $30 less a week, which I always had a problem with the women that after they learned this. You know, when they got hired, they thought it was a great job. But after they learned that they were like second-hand hires, even daughters of superintendents and everybody else that they hired, they all got hired at a lower rate of pay.
To do the same job.
Exact same job. No different whatsoever. So I kind of didn't like that myself. I thought that was unfair at the time, but there was nothing a 19-year-old could do about it. So I worked there for maybe a year and a half. And in 2 other offices, the hot mill office and the cold mill office, there was each a clerk in one of the places that wanted to go on afternoons so that they could go to college during the day, continue their education. In the cold mill office was a fellow by the name of Dick Gioli. He went on to become a dentist, so he obviously did his education. In the hot mill office, there was a fellow by the name of Frank Lamas. They called him Paco. And his father-in-law was a doctor at the clinic. And so I had my choice. They gave me a choice to go to the hat mill or the coal mill. My brother Tom was working in the hat mill office, so I said, well, I'll go with him. I'd get a ride with him. I didn't have a car. I didn't drive. So I transferred to the hat mill in about 1965, around there, 1965, 66. And my job there was to post steel rollings for the hat mill, and it was quite a bit different because I was all by myself in the front office building. And in the hat mill, there was, in the department I was in was called the order department. Later on, it got changed to production scheduling. And there was 4 correspondence clerks. Their job was to deal with sales. And we were upstairs. Downstairs was the mills division, an entirely different department. The 2 departments merged later in 1976, and we became one entity, production scheduling. So I got to meet a lot of people and friends for life. The fella downstairs, Richie Potreitz, I still bowl with him, I golf with him, and Dick Carey, I still bowl with him and golf with him. And we're talking 40 years later. And some great friendships. I saw the first Super Bowl at Richie Potreitz's house the year he got married. We just had a great time together with all these people. And there were some characters. There were some definite characters. When I went to the hat mill office, Mike Cellini worked in there, and he still lives in Lackawanna and Ingham, I believe. A little short fella that had polio as a child. He had braces on both his legs, and he was a tough little character. Not the sharpest knife in a drawer, not a real intelligent guy, but he could do his job very well. But he liked to jab you and poke fun at you. So my first day there, I found out that any new clerk or any new employee had to go to the restaurant in the morning for everybody. There was a restaurant called Cease's. They were throughout the steel plant. And he'd like to pick on me a little bit, and he'd say, hey, boy, I need an egg sandwich and a cup of tea. You know. So me being me and being a wise guy myself, when he got his egg sandwich back, he opened it up and he saw it had relish and mayonnaise and a few other condiments that he wasn't expecting. And he just go, ah. I said, call me boy again, see what you get tomorrow. You know? So it was fun. It was a lot of fun working with my brother Tom, who passed away about 4 years ago. Tom worked with us, Mike worked with us, and it was just a great time. And a few years later, there was an opening for a correspondence clerk A job, they call it, who dealt directly with sales in the galvanizing mill. And I didn't bid on it. I said, well, I got 5 years. These are people with 20 years to get these jobs. I'm not going to get that. So I got a phone call from assistant superintendent of production scheduling. He said, why didn't you bid on a job? I said, because I got common sense. I'm not going to get it. He says, bid on it, you're going to get it. I said, well, that doesn't sound right. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, we're going to take the top bidder and pay them the rate of pay and move you in the job because we want you to do the job. I said, well, okay.
Can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Sure.
Could you explain bidding?
Bidding is when someone either retires, dies, or gets promoted, their job becomes open. And you bid on it based on 3 criteria, actually, in the union book. It's ability to do the job, physical fitness, and seniority. And seniority is last, believe it or not. And ability to do the job is such a criteria, and later on with my experience as a union official, I found out that there's all kinds of ability. Ability doesn't mean, yeah, you teach me a job, I can do it. The company's version of ability is you sit down and you do the job. Now, who can do that to a job you never saw? Virtually impossible. But that's their criteria, and they've been upheld in arbitrations over many, many years. They put the job up for bid when they know it's going to last for a minimum of 90 days. And they have to fill it according to those 3 criteria. So if physical fitness and ability are equal, then they use seniority. That's the way they say it.
So if you and I were bidding for a position, and let's say you had the seniority and you filled most of the criteria, and yet in the case I know you're in the story of telling where you're going to get this position, do I have the right then to go in and say, wait a minute, that shouldn't have happened, that was my job?
Happens all the time.
I can
Grievance.
file some sort of grievance and say, wait a minute, how did he get the position when I really should have been the one
Absolutely,
to get it?
absolutely.
And that's handled by whom?
That's handled by the steward in step one. He talks to the immediate supervisor, but in the case of bidding, it's not the immediate supervisor's responsibility. So it's you'd have to go. They'd send you to like the assistant superintendent of that department, and they'd reduce it to writing in step one and say, well, we feel that Jim Carey's got more ability. They don't have to explain it. They'll explain it later on in the next steps. So that's your written step. Verbal is step one, written is step two, and then step three goes to labor relations, and it's in the hand of the chairman of the grievance committee, or at that time it was called a chief grievance man. Now, what a lot of people don't realize, a lot of union people to this day don't realize, once that union gets in the hands of the grievance, gets in the hands of the union, it's the union's grievance. It's no longer your grievance. They can do whatever they want with it. You can complain, you can go to the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, but it's their grievance. So depending on politics and what have you, depending on who you're dealing with, you may have a chance or you may not. Ability grievances, the many, many years I had to fight them from the union side. I never had to fight them from the company side when I was in supervision. I've read what they call Pike and Fisher. Pike and Fisher are volumes and volumes of arbitration decisions. And 99 out of 100, the company wins those grievances. And because they can show, well, this person, here's his experience, here's this, here's that. Show me that you can do, not so much a better job, but that you can do the job. They force you to say you can do that job.
So in effect, then, the management could make choices as to who was going to get these jobs.
Yeah.
And 99% of the time get the person they chose.
Right.
Now, how often did this come up?
In the case like I had, not too often. The mills people, when they pick like crane operators and jobs like that, they're fighting all the time. And then when they go from what they call a jurisdictional dispute between one local union and another one where the jobs are almost identical, and that guy, the one employee bids to the other union, and then they say, well, no, he can't be a crane operator because he didn't go through all these steps, even though he was operating a crane in the other local, and say the bar mill versus the hot mill or whatever. So it's very complicated, and it's hard to beat them on those kind of cases.
Another quick question. During the bidding process, if there's a job opening and they need someone in there, how quickly would this be resolved?
Not very. They'd move who they wanted in, and then you'd sit for upwards of a year. And depending on who the chairman of the grievance committee is, that might have been withdrawn and you don't even know it.
Now let me ask you one other thing. If I'm in a dispute because you got the position and another job comes up to bid, does that bar me from going after that position because I'm still in the process of this one?
No, you can.
Okay, so it didn't hold.
You can multiple bid 5 different jobs at the same time.
So you weren't held back, or there wasn't anything you lost by going after a position?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you for filling that in. You were saying you had bid for a job that you didn't think you were going to get.
Right, and they moved me into the job. And irony of ironies, the job was correspondence clerk A in the Galvanize, which was held by Tom Rush. And what they did with Tom Rush is they promoted him to supervision. I knew Tom Rush. He was best friends with my brother Tom O'Shei. And they grew up together, and they were friends. And Tom Rush's brother Bobby worked at the steel desk. His father Fran Rush was my first supervisor, my immediate supervisor. Back to the nepotism, which was rampant, which is a good and a bad thing depending on if you have good employees, nepotism is good, and the whole family's good. My dad, I digress a little bit, but I was living at home naturally when I took the job, and my father worked in the office there, and he worked with many of the higher echelon in our department. There were no days when I was on day turn that I could say I'm too tired to go in, because he'd pull me by my leg and say, "You're not going to embarrass me. Get in there." So very few, the work ethic was there for all of us, and there were very few times that I could slough off of work. But Tommy Rush, unlike his brother Bob Rush, who worked for years on what they call a steel desk at the main office, now owns a popular tavern in South Buffalo on Seneca Street, which I belong to, a social club, Hopper's Social Athletic Club. It's called Hopper's Rush In. And all the mayors, Byron Brown was there, Jimmy Griffin, very good friends he was with Jimmy Griffin, the former mayor, very good friends with Bobby Rush. And I used to go steady with Bobby's wife, his now wife, and he keeps telling me he wants to trade me back, and I says, "Only if you take my wife." So we're very good friends, and I go there every Tuesday, and we have a meeting, and we have good times. But they're like night and day, Tom Rush and Bob Rush. Tom Rush, very hyper. We thought his face would explode. He's red-faced when he gets mad. I took over his desk, his job. His telephone had more nicks and scrapes in it from being thrown at the wall. He was just a hot-tempered guy, still is. He worked at Ilio DePaulo's for many years. He's working elsewhere, some other restaurant. Excellent golfer. The whole family is real good golfers, which is another story with Bethlehem. If you're a real good golfer, that might help you. That might help you immensely. Going back to my interview before I got hired, I'm going backwards. The assistant superintendent, which was Fran Rush's boss, where I was going to work in the pneumatic tube room, was a fellow by the name of Gil Snashel, John Gil Snashel. And my job interview consisted of about 45 minutes of him talking about golf. And I never lifted I lived right near Casanova Golf Course, never played golf in my life. I didn't play until I retired when I was 58. I lifted up a club for the first time, so now I kind of enjoy it, but I'm not going to get on the pro tour. But that was a lot of the history and the makeup of Bethlehem Steel. A lot of families, a lot of golfing, socializing, that kind of thing.
The social clubs, I've talked to a few guys. That seems to be a big thing. Everybody, whether it was usually the folks you worked with, I assume, they first got you introduced to these clubs, but it seemed that not only did you work in the plant with these guys, but yes, there was specifically a club or something you did with them outside of work also.
Absolutely, absolutely. There was a bowling league, a now defunct bowling alley, Lucky Strike, which was on Abbott Road, just before Ridge Road. And it was called the Main Office League. At that time, I'm going back to 1972, 3, somewhere around there, you had to work in the office at Bethlehem Steel to bowl in that league. And as things progressed and things fell off, then it had to be you had to work at Bethlehem Steel to bowl in the league. We had our team, which was, I bowled with the hot mill group of guys. There was a metallurgical team. There was a team of interplant police department, accounting teams. There were all these different teams. Turned out, after about 2 years in that league, I became president of it. I was secretary for a while. Then I became president for about the last 20 years that it existed. I was president of a bowling league. A lot of fun. It got to the point where then you had to have 2 employees at Bethlehem Steel because the layoffs in 1982, and I got to thinking, come on, this is silly to start with. Let's just open it up, and we let anybody bowl in it. And it got to the point where my team had 3 employees that were still working, and hardly anybody else in the league was Bethlehem Steel. There was a lot of Lackawanna people, a lot of South Buffalo people. We kind of merged with St. Teresa's Holy Name League, which was bowling was falling off, so we took in 5 of their teams with 7 of ours, and we had a 12-team league. And that was on, Lucky Strike had 24 alleys, 12 on one side, 12 on the other. The other side was all Lackawanna. They called it the Crown Club League, which was on Electric Avenue. There was a place called Crown Club, which was naturally owned by a Bethlehem employee. Bethlehem employees had a lot of side Ventures in Lackawanna. But it was a lot of fun. Great times. These social clubs, like I'm in Hoppers, I'm in a Casanova golf league, which probably has 15 or 20 former Bethlehem employees in it. Just great people. And then the one you came and talked to us at, Jim Donahue, kind of runs the one we meet every first Wednesday of the month at Ponderosa. That is Jimmy runs it basically. He doesn't like to say he runs it. Jim Donahue, who was a shipping foreman in the Galvanizing, a very good friend of mine. But he runs it, and there's no speeches, no meeting per se. You sit down, you shoot the breeze, and have a good time with the people. And that's enjoyable. That really is.
Okay.
Let's see. Onward with the career? Or,
sure.
But, let's see. The galvanized mill is still in operation now. It's Mitel, Acer Mitel. I could have worked for them when I retired, but I wanted to retire. I had almost 40 years. Started when I was 19. I said that was plenty.
When did that switch over from Bethlehem?
Well, I left in 2001. First, it was, and I'm going to probably lose track of this, there were one or two different buyouts before it got to Acer Mitel. So I didn't really turn my back on it, but I didn't follow it that closely. You know, we'd go to, we'd talk a little bit about work. Ironically, my bowling team was, at one point myself, I was chairman of the grievance committee for all the office and technical. The president of the union, Rich Potrates, is on my same bowling team, and two clerks. And we made a rule, never talk about work while we're bowling. My brother Terry was on the team. My brother Terry was an executive with Graphic Controls, downtown Buffalo, who never had a union, and he was always trying to bait us into arguing with him, and we just wouldn't fall for it. No talk about work. We wouldn't talk about work. These first Wednesdays at Ponderosa, naturally we talk about work. Some of the guys are still working there, even on a part-time consultant basis. My former boss, Ron Staub, still works like 1 day a week. He goes in. And so we ask him how things are going, and we still know everybody in there, basically. So, but the union, when I was chairman of the grievance committee,
Can I interrupt you for a
Sure.
second? Let's go back and start. How did you get involved
with the union?
Obviously, you probably joined as a worker.
Had to join.
But
yeah.
why don't you start from the beginning? Tell me about your union experience,
Okay.
because clearly it's something you rose up in.
Oh yeah. It was mandatory you signed there's two things when you got hired at Bethlehem you had to sign. They didn't give you an option. You had to sign union checkoff to join the union, and the other thing was .006 for, they call it the red feather. I'm trying to think.
What was it in regards to?
It was donations for, they forced you to pay 006 because it'll come to me, but the company would pledge, the United Way, the company would pledge for a number, I don't know what the real number was, but say 200,000. Then new hires had to sign .006 of your salary. Other people would give whatever they gave, and if it didn't come up to 200,000, the company had to make up the difference. So they were very pushy with what you donated to the United Way. So those are the two things you had to sign. And later on, if you quit, they'd give you, couldn't quit the union, but you could quit the United Way, and all hell would break loose on you if you did that. So I was in the union. When I worked by myself in that front office, I didn't have much dealings with the union. I had nothing to grieve. I was all by myself. There was nobody doing my work other than myself. Ironically, the assistant superintendent, Gil Snashel, when I was about to transfer to my choice being the hot mill office, he takes me in, and he's passed away now, and the company's bankrupt, so I can tell this little story. He took me in the office. He liked me. He liked the way I work, apparently. And he said, Tim, when you go to the hot mill, put in for the top of the rate. Back then, you didn't get automatic raises. You had to ask for a raise, and unless you were really a fair-haired connected person, you never got that raise. And you'd never get the top of the rate because the corporate used to keep track, I find this out later in supervision, of how many people were at the top of the rate, and they didn't want that many at the top of the rate. So even my dad, with his 40 years, excellent worker, was 50 cents off the top of the rate. So this Gil Snashel, the assistant superintendent, called me in and says, when you get to the hot mill, put in for top of the rate. He said, I'll see what I can do for you. I know you'll have to grieve it. So I go to the hot mill. Now, at that time, there were probably 800 clerical employees in that local union, 3144. 800 clerical employees, which included the main office and all the little pockets all over the steel plant. And they also represented the cleaning ladies and janitors and cafeteria workers. So it was a big local, small in comparison to the 5,000 members of the 2604, which was a strip mill local, 2603, which was the bar mill local, which had the billet yards across the street. Small in comparison, but yet today it would be the whole company. It would be twice the size of the company. So it was fairly big. So I went there, and after, you got company. After a few weeks, I didn't do it immediately, although he told me to do it immediately. I went and asked the supervisor for the top of the rate. His name was Len Reedy, R-E-E-D-Y, from Blaisdell. And he says, are you kidding me? He says, you got a year and a half here. We got people with 25 years don't have the top of the rate. So I feel that I should get the top of the rate. I was not shy, but you know, I never did this before. I never got involved with the union. As it turns out, even with 800 members of this local, downstairs in the office of the hot mill was the president of the union, Joseph Whippick, who went on to be an international rep, and Alfie Buzkowski, B-U-C-Z-K-O-W-S-K-I, who was the chairman of the grievance committee. They both worked in the same office downstairs. So the hot mill was the hotbed, so to speak, of the union. So I put the grievance in. The president, Joe Whippick, who was always, he looked like a senator, white hair, always well-dressed, comes to me in the side and says, are you kidding me? He says, you put this grievance in for top of the rate? And he says, who's your steward? I said, Mike Cellini, that little Mike I mentioned earlier. He said, well, Mike just resigned last week. He wants you to be the steward. It's fine with me. I'll take the job. So I was fighting my own grievance with a little backing from the assistant superintendent, and I got the top of the rate, which in an environment of Bethlehem Steel, nothing's a secret. And all of a sudden, everybody's like, this guy with a year and a half becomes a steward, and he gets the top of the rate, and what's all this favoritism? And really, I became a steward, and I was, with the tutelage of the two fellows downstairs, the president and the chief grievance man, I was kind of a thorn in the side of the company, big time.
Well, again, sorry to interrupt, but
sure.
What is a steward?
A steward is the person in a given area that represents that particular area. Now, in that area I was in, there were only 5 clerks in the order department, which later became production scheduling. So that's who I represented, these 5 clerks. The other clerical downstairs had probably 30 people. And throughout the steel plant, and it's in a contract at that time and up until the time I left, there were a maximum of 35 stewards. Or later on, they became known as assistant grievance committeemen or woman. So depending on which area you were in, and later on when I became the chief grievance man, I had 35 assistants that were stewards basically throughout the steel plant. And it was their job to represent their local people, and in the first step of the grievance procedure to go in, see if they could settle it verbally. If not, they had to reduce it to writing, send me a copy. Then I would set up a meeting, and I would meet with their supervisor, then their superintendent. That was step 1 was verbal. Step 2, reduce it to writing, have a meeting with the immediate supervisor, which, especially in the mid to late 70s, they had absolutely no authority to settle anything, which caused a lot of animosity. You felt like you're going in there to argue something that you might as well talk to the wall, because they're not going to ever say okay. They went to the new regime that the company sent in from Burns Harbor to say no to everything. That was their job. Lackawanna in 1977 had 5,600 outstanding grievances, more than all of Bethlehem Steel combined. Just Lackawanna.
I'd heard that. It was one of the...
Yeah, it was a hotbed, and they had walkouts, which other places. Burns Harbor was a fairly new plant, and they were just learning, and Sparrows Point was an older plant, and they were pounded down, and Johnstown was afraid of shutting down. So they had all this intimidation going on, and Lackawanna said, "You're going to shut us down? Shut us down. You know, we got the workers." You know,
how old were you when you became steward?
Probably 21.
Now, is that normal?
That's very young.
It sounds to me like that's a very young time to become a steward.
Very young.
And so, obviously, older employees with greater and longer experience than you had to come to you or spoke to you with the expectation that you would take their grievance forward, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And were they comfortable with that?
Not at first, but when we did sit down with the company, then they knew I was on their side and I'd argue for them. One example later on is I argued for 2 hours for someone who they docked 1 hour's pay. Then I said to the superintendent, I says, "You know, you held yourself up, your assistant, your 2 assistants, and us 4 from the union for an hour's pay. It's a principle of the thing." I says, "That's right. That's why we could have paid him the hour." We said, "No, and you could have paid him the hour. You wouldn't." And
did you have other responsibilities as a steward, and were you compensated differently by the union for this position, or is this something you took on?
I took it on, and the only compensation they gave you was lost time. If I had to go to a meeting, or if I had to meet outside the plant with the heads of the union, or with someone, like if somebody was on shift work and I had to meet them at the union office, I would leave work. I wouldn't make any money. If I had 2 hours of lost pay, the union, I'd have to put that in, and the union would compensate me that way. Any job I ever had throughout my career with the union, there was never a paid. The bigger locals used to pay their president, their chief grievance man, and even their safety people sometimes. Our local, the office and technical workers, never did. We just gave you the difference, and I was fine with that. We kidded that when I'd go away to Pittsburgh, we kind of frowned on some of the other union leaders who bunked 4 to a room and ate bologna sandwiches. We always said these outside trips, and I'd stay at union meetings to 100 people. Actually, it cost me money out of my pocket because we're not going to live like that. You know, but there's different lifestyles, and what you thought about money. You know, if you were all for money, I never was, never will be, and it's just the way it was. You know.
And how did you move up in the union?
I was the steward in a hat mill and representing those people in production scheduling. And when the merger agreement came about, where it was a gigantic merger between 2 huge departments, and I was very involved with that, again because of my proximity to the union president and grievance chairman. And they kind of took me under their wing, taught me much about the union, many things I had no idea. And I was very involved in those negotiations. And what happened was the company didn't want to go through this hundreds and hundreds of grievances about the merger, because the company said, "We're merging these 2 departments, and now all of a sudden work that I was doing is now being done by someone that was in the other department." So I would grieve it. He would grieve it, saying it's a significant job change, I want to raise. I would grieve it that he's taking my work, and there were hundreds and hundreds of grievances. So I had all those. I had all those grievances from these 5 employees. We must have had 210 grievances, which is quite a bit. And on the other side, they probably had 500 grievances. And that was just in the hot mill. They had the cold mill office had the same situation, even bigger, and various other little pockets throughout the plant. So I was very involved in that. The final settlement of that, I was at the meeting with the company, with the president of the union and the international. I got to know many people in the international. And he told us, Joe Lippick, the president, says, "What do you think? I'm going to look for $125,000 to settle all the grievances, and we'll settle them. We'll tell the company, we'll decide how we're going to settle these grievances. Just, we'll do the paperwork. So I said, that's great. We're thinking 40,000, 30,000, we're dividing it up. Not so much on how many grievances, but how many people signed grievances. So we go in there, and Joe Lippick, being Joe Lippick, didn't say 125, he said 250,000. And the company says, you got it. Just like that. Then he said later, I made a mistake.
Should ask for 500,000.
He thought he doubled it. We're sweating, and we got it. And we settled those grievances.
And when you say you settled them, so everyone was given an apportionment of that amount?
Whoever signed a grievance and still had an ongoing grievance got a portion based on their seniority. There was a formula they used. Now that caused tons of problem for the hierarchy of our union, because I think I mentioned before, the chairman of the grievance committee, I loved him, he taught me a lot, but I used to fight with him myself because he never let you know where your grievance stood. He could have withdrawn it and you never knew it. Well, as it turns out, many people had their grievances withdrawn. And maybe they weren't the best grievances of the world, but it might have been a personality thing. He withdrew. And when the list came out of who's getting paid, many of these people's names weren't on that list. So they had copies of the grievance. They never knew what happened to it. He had a copy. He had withdrawn on it and his name a year before, and they never knew it. They went to the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board. Many, many years later, this thing dragged on forever to the point where I had to go. Because he retired, I got his job.
So was that money held up until everybody was...
No, they paid it up.
But then what was left to, what would have been, or nothing?
Nothing was left, and then it would have been the company and the union responsible to pay it somehow. And he retired in 1976, I believe, 77. Joe Lippick, the president previous to that, right after these settlements, got promoted to international job in Pittsburgh. There was a new president. I became campaign manager for my friend Rich Potrates, who ran against the president. We ousted him. Richie promoted me when Alfie retired. This gets confusing to the grievance chairman, it was called at the time. And then I ran on my own and won election. So he and I basically ran the union the way Joe Lippick and Alfie did. And to our chagrin, later on, we had to answer for all the things they did. Came with the territory.
And what year was this?
Let's see, 77 I became chief grievance man.
Okay, and you and I spoke before we began the recording, and you said there was the good years, and you could almost divide it in half.
Yeah.
Could you go into that a bit?
Well, 1976 actually 76 I got appointed, 77 I ran for the job. 1977 saw the end of structural steel in Lackawanna. They shut it down completely. Boom. So part of my job had to sit with all the clerks, and there were probably in structural maybe 100, 120. My father being the senior most clerk in that department. They all lost their jobs. They all got laid off. I had to sit in a building with the company as the union rep and sign their papers whether or not they wanted to continue on the rolls, hoping for a recall, which there's no department left, or they would take severance, which someone in my father's situation and older people wouldn't take severance because they're pension eligible, or sign for whatever pension that they were eligible for. So thinking about maybe in 1976, I was 33, 34 years old, having to sign away my father's rights at the steel plant, which I had to do again with my brother in 1982.
Did they understand that it was really over this time? Or did they think it was just another...
My father knew it was over. My brother said they just banked the furnaces. He worked in the office also. They banked the furnaces, they'll restart them, they're trying to scare us. A lot of people had that attitude. We didn't.
Yeah, of course, this isn't the first time. There's been time and time again, there was shutdown startups. The economy would call how much steel was necessary. So that's what I wonder. How many people really sat there and said, okay, this is going to be 6 months, who knows how long, it's going to be tough, but we're going to be back there?
I'd say about, if I had to put a number on it, I'd say 10% believed it was a permanent shutdown. The rest of them thought it would come back.
So how could you do your job and have them sign off on these things when they believed they were going to be back at work?
Contractually, they had to because they announced it. They give us, I said boom, structural, but they did give a 90-day. There's contractual things that they had to do. Was 90 days before a permanent shutdown, they had to notify the union. Well, they gave that notification, but nobody believed it. That's because they gave those notifications before and rescinded them. So this time, they did it. They actually banked structural, shut it down, and started dismantling things. So you knew structural was in big trouble. Crazily, at that time, as structural was going down, my father being, he had almost 40 years, he was one of the senior guys. He wasn't, he started real young, he wasn't 60 years old yet, but he was continuing to work and all the junior people were getting laid off. As the junior people, as this gets complicated again, as the junior people are getting laid off, the strip mill, accounting, everybody needed employees at that time. So instead of bidding the jobs, we talked about bidding before, this is a permanent job. Instead of bidding them, some areas, they drew these workers from structural right in. Some of them didn't even have a day off. Left on Friday structural, started in accounting on Monday. Other places bid it, and the company didn't get their act straight. In some places they bid it, and these structural people could have bid in competition with other people in their department, called a plant-wide bid because their department shut down. So as this is happening, people are getting moved over, getting ensconced in jobs. When they finally rolled the last I-beam in structural, the handful of people that were left, maybe 8 or 10, went to the street. And they were the senior-most people because the company didn't bid these jobs in a progressive way, the way they should have. And that became one of the biggest headaches I had between the Justice Department, getting ahead of myself again, but trying to recreate what happened and do it in a proper way that the right people would get these jobs. We had to do it after the fact, almost 7 years later. And we're Judge Poindexter in Alabama, who did the consent decree, which caused many, many problems in Lackawanna. I could go into some of them. That was one of them. He said you have to reconstruct what happened in structural. And my dad was off for 2 years at that time. My mother liked the idea he was home. He was one of those guys that was all work and never took a day off sick. And he had a record one time of 118 days in a row without a day off, worked 7 days a week. And he was a clerk, but they relied on him and he was good at it. So she didn't want him to go back. When we did reconstruct everything, he certainly would have gotten a job. He could have worked till he wanted to. But the reconstruction was, I could take 5 hours to tell you how that happened. It was horrendous, absolutely horrendous. Another problem, and I'm jumping around a little bit, but the charwomen and janitors, they used to call the cleaning ladies charwomen. The men they call janitors. Again, like I said earlier with the clerical, hire the women as C clerks, pay them less, hire the men as B clerks. In the janitorial service, they hired the women as cleaning ladies, the men as janitors, and paid them less. Basically doing the same job. The women worked 4 hours a day, the janitors worked 8 hours a day. Well, Judge Pointer in Alabama looked at those jobs and said, there's no difference in those jobs. He drew a circle around them. He said, okay, union and company, somehow straighten that out.
How would you go back and straighten that out?
Good Lord, what a mess.
We're talking financially.
Financially.
That's really all you could do at this point.
Well, no, we did it job-wise, too. And that was a horrendous mess. Because a lot of these women, again, let's go back to nepotism, were wives of supervisors. They're cleaning ladies. So they wanted a 4-hour job. They didn't want an 8-hour job. Our initial idea was make them all 8-hour jobs, make them all bid on them, and we're done. Pay to back pay. The women were in an uproar. the cleaning ladies. No, half of them, 3/4 of them didn't want to work 8 hours. Didn't want to empty garbage cans. Didn't want to do, even though they were supposed to do it, the janitors did them. The janitors were stronger men, mostly black. My steward in there was a fellow by the name of Virgil Horn. And I had to go up in front of Judge Curtin and explain to him this whole situation. And it was easy for me to explain because the company did it. The union didn't do it. But the union acquiesced to it. Never fought it, never said this is wrong. You know, it was long before my time, but I explained it as honestly as I could. Judge Curtin ruled that it's one job, just like Judge Pointer said. And as I walked out of the courtroom, I had to say to Virgil Horn, you're going to lose your job. So that was another tough one. There's a steward of mine, he was a great guy, a black guy. He'd vote for whoever I said to vote. When they had union elections, he, Mr. O'Shei, who should I vote for? I can't tell you, Virgil, but here's who I like, you know.
So you've got the courts now interfering in the system.
Big time.
And every time they interfered, of course, it threw a wrench in this racket, for better or for worse.
Mostly for worse. In one case, yeah, trying to straighten out, they previously straightened out that A, B, and C business with the women. They knew that was wrong, the company. They never gave back pay, but here's how they fixed it. They hired all the men as C clerks. They didn't make the women B clerks, which got paid more. Right? I told you, I got hired as a clerk B. The woman doing an identical job with me got hired as a clerk C. So when the government came in and looked at that and said that was wrong, okay, we're hiring them all as a lower rate, not the equal rate.
Why did the government come in, Tim? I mean, why was it because someone who grieved, was unhappy, went to the National Labor?
Yeah, mostly it was the discrimination cases that mostly evolved, I would say, in the coke ovens, and it was all black versus white situation.
But they would have gone through the union first, correct?
You mean the people that were aggrieved? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they would have exhausted their administrative options through you guys, said, I'm not happy with this.
When we disposed of it one way or the other, if we couldn't settle it, obviously, the company wouldn't agree, didn't want to withdraw it. Sometimes they tell you to withdraw it, and then the union would be on the hook for what you have to explain why you withdrew it. If the person really wanted to move it along with the National Labor Relations Board, they had to go, like you said, through the union first. Well, the most expeditious way of doing it, if I let it go through first step, second, third, fourth, arbitration, pre-arbs, you're talking 2-3 years. If I withdraw it without prejudice, then they can say, okay, here's my piece of paper from the union withdrew it, the company did it, well, why do the union withdraw it? I made that person right on there, I wish they had this withdrawn. And then that flew.
So if I'm a person who feels like they're grieved for whatever reason, I don't feel like I'm getting satisfaction from my union, the company obviously isn't giving me any satisfaction, and I go into federal court with this, correct?
Right.
Am I now suing the union and the company?
Yes.
Right, because the union's no longer on my side.
Right.
I'm sort of putting myself out there on my own.
Most cases, like the one I just explained, the other ones, yeah, they're going against the union also. The cases I had, we had our own lawyers locally, Joe Giroux. I see he's still practicing law. He was a young fellow at the time. He practices law for the postal union. That's why I see it in my son's newspapers. I read those. But we have an agreement with the aggrieved person, and I do have something in writing that's not necessarily on the grievance, that they're not going to seek anything from the union. That was just to expedite the case itself. Because knowing full well that it's just a delay tactic on a company's part. So I agreed to those kind of things, but I had to cover myself that they're not coming after me. You know? Did
it affect the person who brought it? I mean, did the rest of the union look at the person and say, great, now you're a troublemaker as far as we're concerned? Or
occasionally, not always. I always was of the opinion you have a right to do whatever you want to do, and I'll help you if I can. But if I'm, especially in the late 70s, early 80s, there was no way that the company was going to agree to anything. They just sent these young labor relations experts in from Burns Harbor to say no to everything. You didn't have Jim McMahon, who was a reasonable man who used to handle the clerical staff, and then he was in labor relations. 2 or 3 other fellows that you could deal with, and at the beginning, this is the irony of it. Charlie Furman, he was a local guy who ended up being a superintendent of labor relations for all of Bethlehem Steel. Local guy I used to deal with. And we got along, but I knew he was there to say no. He got here in the 70s. So I took him on a side one time. He was a little bit younger than I am. Well, maybe 10 years younger, more than a little bit. I said, Charlie, look, I had these grievances. This is what I want. Here's $100 for this guy, 20 for this, blah, blah, so forth and so on. I said, Charlie, you're looking for numbers. I said, here's what you want. You want to say that you beat the union 90% of the time. I want the person to get satisfied. I'll withdraw them without prejudice. You pay them what you're supposed to. And as goofy as that sounds, that's the way we settle these things. I withdrew the grievance based on a payment of $100. Well, that's what the person asked for.
Right. It's not that goofy. It's not like, that's almost all criminal. I'm not using that as an example. It's criminal.
Yeah, but that's
how
true.
The courts work. They settle out, and each can say that they both won and walk away happly. And
right. I'm saying I withdrew. I'm saying I lost, right. Which I don't have that kind of ego to say. I don't keep percentages. They do.
But your members are happy.
Right.
That's important to you too. If they're going to vote for you again, if you have to go work with these folks, and then he gets to put a check in his column that he was successful also.
Right. I made my mind up when I took over the chief grievance job. And I liked Alfie. He's passed on since, but I didn't like the way he operated with not keeping people apprised of where their grievance was and what happened. So every union meeting, if you didn't come to the union meeting, you get it out of the minutes. I'm not going to call 100 people. I'm going to make a report, and I'm going to tell you exactly where it stands and what happened to your grievance. And some people didn't like it, but I had to have a good reason for it.
How did this leave you? I mean, it sounds to me like this. You've got 250 grievances at one point. How does it leave you time to do your regular job?
When I was chief grievance man, I probably worked 2 days a week for the company and 3 days a week for the union. Yeah, office at home. Yeah, me being me, I'd stay, like if I had a mini arbitration, which I had to handle against the company's labor relations, it wasn't unusual for me to stay up till 3 or 4 in the morning reading these Pike and Fisher books, looking for something. I never lost a mini arbitration. It cost you $1,500 to mini arbitrate a case, and it usually was a firing or penalties or things like that. I never lost a case. We only had 3. Big locals don't even mini arbitrate.
You're representing these folks. What about those folks that you knew were just wrong? I mean, you've got members. You're expected to represent them regardless, I assume. But you just know they're wrong and they're pushing something. Did you have a lot of latitude in how to handle those? I
had all the latitude in the world, and you're exactly right. And the company used to say to me, how can you represent this person? And I can give you 2 great examples, but my answer to the company always was, I raised my hand and took an oath. So you didn't have to be a nasty person as you are. I have to represent this person. I might not like him, but I have to. One of my I think it's one of the funniest stories I ever told anybody. And many times when I was chief grievance man, I'd go from little pockets of offices. They only had 3 or 4 clerks, but they were our clerks, and their steward might have to be somewhere else and don't even know that person. Well, this little office, and I wouldn't even know what the grievance is about till I got there. This little office, this fellow was there, and he's passed on too, so I'll use his name. His name was Jay Whitney, J-A-Y. Never heard of him, didn't know who he was. I get there, the briefcase and the top coat and all that, and try to scare their boss. He don't know who I am, but here comes the union. And I was always amazed that I could put some fear into some of these supervisors, because we came in like that with black top coats. We did that on purpose, and briefcases. So
no bad stuff.
I said, okay, let me meet with the steward and this Jay Whitney. I said, well, what's your case? He said he worked in a billet yard office, and he said, well, my car broke down, and I borrowed my sister's car, and she didn't have a sticker to get inside the plant. So when I went to pull in, the police at the gate wouldn't let me in, so I stayed home for 3 days till my car was fixed. Okay. So we go in, we talk about it. The supervisor's assistant superintendent's name was Teddy Slaberski. I dealt with him before with other clerks, and decent guy. I had a few drinks with him at the Wyndham Grill. Decent fella. Studied to be a priest. So I said, I kind of gave an argument, not trying to be half-hearted, but I said, everybody leave the room, talk to Teddy. I said, Teddy, what can you do for me here? I said, the guy's an idiot. I said, come on. He says, well, he stayed home 3 days. He says, I'll tell you what. He says, I'll penalize him 1 day for being stupid. He said, I'll give him 2 days pay back. I said, okay, you're going to give him 2 days. I go out in the hallway, and I say to Jay Whitney, I says, he'll give you 1 day back, not the 2 that Teddy promised. What? That's not right. I got back 3 days. Said, give me a minute. I go back in. How's it going, Ted? I come out. I say, I got you 2 days. 2 days, I'm still getting Doc the day's pay. What would you do, Mr. O'Shei? I said, I'd pull down his pants and kiss him on the rump because you don't deserve anything. And that was a funny one.
He took it.
He took it. Well, he had no choice. I signed it, and he got it.
So on a broader level, did this system reward folks who might not have worked as hard, or did the people who, like yourself, and you talked about your father, who put in these hours and put in their time, was the hard work rewarded? Or did, and maybe I'm not being clear.
No, that's I understand what you're saying, and that's a question that often came up. And the thing I can tell you, Jim, is that when the company changed their policy for reporting off and getting doctor slips and all that, there were people that were off 6 months of the year, because as a clerk, you were allowed up to 6 months off. Somewhere during the year, you could take out 3 weeks sick. This week sick. So the company changed the policy and made you get a doctor slip the second time you did it. And a lot of the better people, like my dad and like a lot of people that I worked with, good, we want to get those other clerks. I said, well, yeah, yes, and no. I said, I got to fight against it because it's not in the contract and it's a new program and I'm fighting against it. They said, well, you're representing these, and they named the people. And I said, well, they get away with this, then the next move is the first time you're off sick, go to the doctor and get a slip. So we got to stop them somewhere. And it's not contractual. Let them bring it up in negotiations. And it was always that push-pull with the poor workers, what you call a poor worker, a bad worker, somebody that took advantage of the system. My sons are like me more than my wife. I got to say this. My wife worked at the post office. She always thought that you had these days coming, you get them.
Sure.
I was never of that opinion. As a clerk, when I could have taken all the time, I went like 4 years without a day off sick. I'd come in when I was sick because I figured I'd better than being at home. But it's different work ethics, and I always appreciated people that had my kind of work ethic, but I understood the other ones. But I never liked taking advantage. It's there if you need it, I always said. And if you don't need it, you shouldn't use it.
But again, and I'm going to ask you the question again, though, did it sort of average all the workers then because of that? I mean, or were you rewarded if you were the guy who came in and worked hard?
Well, possibly the way I look at it, the way I became a supervisor because of the way I was. That way you're rewarded if you want to go into supervision. I never did want to go into supervision. I used to have disdain for most of them because it was an old boys network. It was, I'll tell you a funny one. When my brother Tom and I worked in the Galvanizing office, they wanted both of us to go into supervision. They gave us a card that you had to fill out, and one of the questions on the card was race, and I put human. And I said to my brother Tom, I says, hey, you filled it out. What'd you put down for race? He says, the third race at Belmont. And I said, I don't think either one of us are becoming supervisors. And we just didn't care. You know, that was Tom. My brother was a brilliant guy, and he had 5 kids. When he got laid off in 1982 and lost his job, he was offered jobs left and right, and he says, no, I always wanted to live on welfare. You know, So he was a South Buffalo guy all the way, and he just never worked again. Never worked again. But yeah, if you were a good worker, my father was offered supervision many, many times. He had a disdain for his bosses, so he didn't want to do it.
To that end, the guys I've talked to who worked at the mill, I mean, obviously my generation, the idea is you go to work, it's collaborative, it's not a top-down management, or at least it does appear to be. One could argue all day long, it still is.
Yeah.
But it seems to me, the guys I've talked to at the mill, your boss is your boss, and he could come in and just, you're going to do this, or I'm going to kick your ass, or this and this. And it's almost shocking to hear it. It's almost like it's almost military.
Later on, when I went into supervision and they sent me to all these supervisory classes and sent me to Burns Harbor, these outside concerns that would come in said that, and I'd talk to them separately because they knew I had the union experience and now I'm a supervisor. They said Bethlehem Steel had the worst culture they ever saw.
In terms of? In
terms of supervisor versus the workforce. That exactly what you said. I say to do it, do it. And that's it. It got to a point at one time when they moved one of our supervisors out when I was still clerking, and they moved in this most obnoxious guy who happens to still be working out there. I ended up being his boss for a while. But they moved him in, and I was a correspondence clerk. Part of the job as a correspondence clerk was to tell other clerks to ship this, ship that. If you had a credit okay, in other words, a company was in trouble financially, they had to give a check to us first before we ship them anything. Mm-hmm. So I told him, I says, this is a credit hold problem. He says, it doesn't say it on there. He says, I know it's a credit hold problem. I talked to the salesman. Ship it. I says, write your name on there. You told me to ship it. And sure enough, they got it. They went into bankruptcy and no money. And that's it. Do it. When he says do it, fine,
And how, what was if you ended up with a bad supervisor in any given area, what are the workers' opportunities there to get rid of this person, to move them along, or was there not? That's just,
It really wasn't. You would just have such a divide that you wouldn't cooperate. You'd do a bare minimum. You'd grieve everything he did. You put a grievance in on every move he made. And they knew, the higher echelons. Every once in a while, they'd move someone like that out because he was causing a problem.
Yeah, that would have to show up at some point to the people before you, or I assume they're trying to bid out.
Yeah, you would
trying
see
to get
that
out from underneath them, and the productivity must stop.
Absolutely.
So yeah. I guess in that case, they are doing something then to move these bosses along.
Depending on who the top gun was. Our department went from, when I got hired as a fellow, the superintendent, they call him the Great White Father. You never saw him. These guys were in the main office, ivory tower we called it. You'd never see him. Never see him once in your life. His name was Cletus Weaver. After him was Flanagan, Bill Flanagan. And one of the funniest stories in the world, a humorous story, we had a temporary supervisor come in when I was in the hot mill with Mike Cellini, my brother Tom, two other fellows, John Vanderwerf, George Como. It was hotter than heck. It was one of those 90-degree July days. The air conditioning wasn't working. And our supervisor by the name of Jimmy Petkovsky, a nice guy, Tim, go over to, I was again the youngest guy, go over to the restaurant, get us something cold, will you? Jeez, we're roasting here, get us something over here. He gave me a $10 bill. So I go over there, and this restaurant is a full-blown restaurant. So he says, I got about 8 slices of watermelon. I said, this would be good. This would be funny. We'll sit there and eat watermelon. The first time, and this is Murphy's Law, the superintendent of the production scheduling department came in at 2 in the afternoon. We're sitting around eating watermelon. You can't write something like that. You can't make it up. It's just funny things. Yeah.
So on that same thought, we talked about the social clubs earlier. If you moved up the ladder, if you will, so you're working with a bunch of guys, and you're more or less on the same level, and then you became a supervisor. Are you socializing with the supervisors outside of work? Because now you've got a different relationship. Or did that supervisor go on to a different club, a different social path? How did that work when you start moving up and you're leaving guys behind, if you will?
When I went into supervision, it was a time right after they sold Briarwood, the country club. So I didn't have to belong to that, which I would have found problems belonging to. I don't like that kind of. I can socialize. I've sat with Mario Cuomo when he was governor. I sat with all those, Jack Kemp, D'Amato. Sat with them all. I can talk to them. But that kind of pecking order kind of thing I never liked. So I stayed with my friends. When I was supervisor for those 12 years, at the beginning I went to lunch with my supervisor, which still to this day is one of my best friends, comes to that luncheon. I was sitting, he was on my left, Ronnie Staub. We're still best friends. But my friends in the union remained my friends. And I used to go to lunch with Ronnie and the head of industrial engineering, Billy Hall. And got to be too much work talk at lunchtime. I said, no, I'm done with this, fellas. I said, I'm going to bring a lunch or whatever, send it in. My office was probably as big as this because I used to have to run customer service meetings 3 days a week with all the department heads. So I had a big with tables and stuff. So I invited my friend Richie, who was still president of the union, and Dick Casseri, who was sitting across from me at that luncheon. And we ate lunch together every day, even though I was their boss. Still bowled with them, golf with them. I'd never say, hey, I'm your boss, do this.
But was that the norm?
No, not at all. But in our department, with a few exceptions, Ronnie Staub being one, he was the head of the whole thing. He treated everybody equally. I would have never went into supervision if he wasn't the boss, which is kind of a... I told you the head of our department, Jerry Brocob, went to American Brass. There was a toss-up between Jeffrey Ball and Ron Staub, who's going to get the head of production scheduling. And I told the overall head, who I had to meet with, Dick Peoples, I'm getting confused here, I don't want to confuse you, that couple criteria. I would never fight the union. I said, I'm not going to handle union relations at all. And secondly, Ronnie Staub had to be the boss. So maybe that threw it his way. They didn't give it to Jeff Ball. He left and went to American Brass with Brokaw.
Because when you went into management, you're out of the union now.
Right. I can always have the ability to go back to the same job, actually whatever job I would have attained. And just to follow up to that, Dick Peoples, who was the superintendent of all the galvanized, retired after about 2-3 years. They sent in a young man named Jack Kinsey from Burns Harbor to do the job. He pulls me into his office and says, I'm putting you in charge of relations with the union. I said, no, you're not. I said, I got a deal with Dick Peoples. I took this job based on that. He says, he's retired. I said, well, if you're forcing me, then I'm going back to being a clerk. Simple as that. So I straightened out the superintendent.
And he accepted that.
He did. Ronnie Staub always warned him when he first got hired. There was a picture of him right at his transition, taking over to Galvanize, in Time magazine, in a black suit, white gloves, white hard hat, with the door of a car. And it was, Bethlehem Steel makes it for GM. So the very first day we met him, we're sitting in my boss's office, Ronnie's office, and we're talking to him, and he says, what do you think of that picture? Do I look fat or something? Kind of pudgy, but not a fat guy. And one of the girls says, no, you look great. You look, He says to me, what about you, O'Shei? What do I look like? And Ronnie Staub goes like this. He said, you shouldn't have asked him. I shouldn't have asked him. I said, well, with the black suit and the white gloves, you look a little bit like Mickey Mouse. He laughed, and he says, boy, I get a straight answer from him. He says, you always will. It's just the way it is,
Another question, I've been sort of jotting some things down when you're talking, and looking at, again, your history. Obviously, there was a time when the unions sat down with management. You guys worked things out again. You can argue all day, was it too much, was it too little? That's not for today. When did that change? I mean, it's always sort of said, well, the Reagan years came in and Reagan turned his back on labor. Again, you could argue that yes or no, but when, in your opinion, did you feel that we're going to the table, but it doesn't matter what we ask for anymore because A, it's either over, or we're going to try to help save what's left over?
I would say in the very late 70s, when they sent in that crew from Burns Harbor to say no to everything, and contract negotiations got to a point where it was useless. You feel silly handing them your demands and taking their demands, and you know nothing's going to happen. But 2 months in, well, the reason I spent 2 months in Pittsburgh was 3144, my clerical local, was the only unionized. Us and the mines out in Minnesota. Burns Harbor was all non-bargaining unit clerks. Johnstown, Sparrows Point. So now all of a sudden, the company in the late 70s is taking things away on the non-union people. What does that do? That causes them to think about joining a union. So the first time they sent Richie, the president, and me, the International Union sent us to Sparrows Point to talk in front of a couple hundred people that were thinking about joining a union. So we went there, and I told them, and the International got mad at me because I like to talk straight. I said, the International, because they got organizers, they have organizers that they send ahead of time. I said, let's not kid ourselves. The company organized you, the union didn't. They took everything that could away from you, taking away weeks of vacation, taking away some of your pay, taking this away, that away, that away. The company's organizing you. Well, the International got mad at me for saying their organizers didn't do the job. I said, well, yeah, they did. They facilitated it, but the company did it. So then when we went to Johnstown, the International sent us two to Johnstown. They said, well, we don't want O'Shei to speak so much. So what I did there, and what they loved, because I investigated, because there were some former supervisors, they got transferred to Johnstown, and then they knocked them back into being clerks, still in Johnstown. So I looked these guys up. I graduated from timing with one of them, Jimmy Rich. I asked him what was going on, and, give me the lay of the land and what's happening in Johnstown. And he says, well, they got these outside contractors coming in. Well, they're from EDS or CTG or something doing computer work. And we grieved it. I said, well, we grieved it in Lackawanna. We got them kicked out, and I got like, $80,000 in back pay for people that were laid off. So when I went to speak at Johnstown, the International was wary of me saying my usual speech about the company organizing them. I brought copies of the grievance that we settled and got $80,000 kicking these non-union people out. And that kind of swayed them. They all voted for the union. They all ended up joining the union. And that's why Richie and I had to spend 2 months in Pittsburgh, because they never had a contract. And we were there as consultants from the International. Our local didn't have to pay. The International paid. And we stayed down there to help them with their new contracts. And we had to be very careful, because you have what you call local working conditions. It's Article 2. And all that is this is what you do, but it's not written down anywhere. You have to prove it sometimes. Well, we had tons of that. Things that the International didn't know we had. We had a thing called rate retention. If you became a $1,000 a week correspondence clerk, and cutbacks came, and they knocked you down to inputting or something, which paid $500 a week. And our rate retention, once you attained that top rate, no matter what job they put you on, it gave them flexibility to put the better worker here and a not so good worker there, but everybody kept the rates. Well, all these other places didn't have that. When they knocked you down, they knocked you down. So the International wanted to put an article in a contract to get 80% when they knocked you down. I said, we don't want that. Yeah, you do. I said, we got something better. What do you have? Because this fellow's from Baltimore. He doesn't. He's in charge of our negotiations. He has no idea what we have. I said, that's one of many things. He says, you have to write them down. I says, no. You write down what you want to get, and I'll tell you if we want it. So it got to a joke that I'd stand up and say, except Lackawanna. We didn't want it. Whatever you're getting for them, we don't want it. So they got hard rolls and croissants one day, and they put a sign on there for everybody except Lackawanna. We don't want them. We don't want nothing.
So what happened later on then when you couldn't negotiate anymore? Basically, I assume the company had all the chits because they were starting to shut down and basically weren't going to come to the table. Yeah. How do you take that back to your members then? And how do you make them understand that there really is nothing you can do? Did they? I guess there's multiple parts of this. Did they accept it? Did they understand it? What did it take them to understand that there was trouble looming and it was real this time?
I think with the structural shutdown completely, And I'd get up at a union meeting and say, hey, my father lost his job, my brother lost his job. We still have a few hundred people here, and if the International can't do anything, we're all going to lose our jobs. I got up as a supervisor, digressing a little bit, but to tell you that the newer workers from the coke ovens that are working now in the coal mill and the tannin mills and the pickler house and all that, they were going to fight the company on something. They were going to walk out. And Greg Paolini, who was the superintendent at the time, called everybody in, and he asked me to say something. And I said, look, I've been here a long time. I've seen the shutdowns. I've seen the tears. I've seen the suicides. Believe them. You got to believe them. I don't like believing them. I never believed them. I always thought they lied. Things are different now. And, you know, you're not going to cave in on everything. You still have your rights. But don't be some of the nonsense grievances they were putting in, that they wanted two rolls of toilet paper. And you just, you know, it used to be you did that kind of thing, so you give the company this pile and say, all right, here's the junk. There's no junk anymore. Do serious stuff and be done with it. Yeah. And it was hard.
And did they understand?
Some did. You're always going to have the militants that don't. And
they understood when the door's locked. And
to this day, some people
still waiting for it to open up.
You have the windmills out there, and they say, "Oh, that's part of Bethlehem." No, that's not part of Bethlehem.
Yeah, speaking of you, Tim, it's interesting. I mean, let me ask you this. Maybe this will answer the question. If you hadn't, I mean, you're 19 years old, right out of high school. You went to work in the mills. Was there something else you thought about doing? And in retrospect, is there something you would rather have done?
My parents, those times were different, where I could have gone to college. They would have paid my freight. My two brothers stuck their foot in college. My second oldest, Carey, the one at graphic controls, he ended up getting his degree when he was like 52 years old. I wish I would have gone on to college. I probably, maybe even law school. There's a lot of lawyers in the family. Or even a teacher. I always thought teaching would be a good thing. I have fights with my brother over teachers. I stick up for him, he's against them.
But, I mean, I would have said law school probably would have seemed right for your personality. But don't you think it's also interesting that even without going to law school, clearly you bubbled up into this position. Clearly you were doing legal matters and working with lawyers all day long at these union matters. So it almost sort of came to fruition.
Absolutely.
That you followed the path, maybe a little bit more awkwardly, to something that obviously fits your disposition.
I ended up knowing the postal contract as good as Bethlehem Steel's because my wife became a steward and I did a lot of work for her.
What do you? Let me jump ahead. So you see these things going on now. They talk about GM. The unions at GM, I think, was it Boeing was going to strike not too long ago up in Seattle?
In Seattle, yeah.
How do you feel about it looking at them? I mean, you must have a reaction to their.
You want to, even like going back to Ronald Reagan with firing the
air traffic
controllers. You have mixed emotions about that. You always do. You say, well, it's people's safety involved. They shouldn't have walked out. The unions have been on such a downward spiral, and now they're thinking Obama's, his election will bring it back, and this business about signing the cards, that's a key thing. I forget the car mark they call it, where right now you can do it anonymously, but now they want to do it in front of people. That's the Democratic. When a non-union place wants to have a union, the NLRB will come in with the. Have an election. Well, the way it is now, you do it anonymously. You fill out a card and you say yes or no, or however it is. The way it used to be and the way the Democrats want it now, and Obama is pledging to do it, is that you have to do that in front of your coworker, and everybody's going to know how you voted. And that's too much intimidation. I don't agree with that. I've seen both sides of it, and I think the anonymous way is much better, not knowing.
I know at one time when they spoke about the unions, and obviously with the change in the dynamics of the way people work in this country, going to office buildings more than going into mills, that there was an idea that the unions looked to those workers, especially the support staff, being able to unionize them, and it never happened. Something you ever thought about too? Like, why was that not successful? what is keeping? And we talked about banking a little bit. There's no unions in banks, and yet there's thousands of tellers. The support staff in banks is tremendous, yet they've never unionized.
That's very true, and you would think they would. My son, who was in Michigan, worked at Huntington Bank. He was a bank manager of one of the branches at one time. The first thing he had to do was go in there and fire a couple of the tellers. He hated it. He says, "Why don't they have a union? Why do I have to do this? First thing on the job, 2 weeks, and I got to fire 2 people." I can't really answer that. I don't. They're maybe so separated and diverse, and there's not a group that would. Somebody has to step forward and organize it, and usually that person, when you're non-union, they'll find a way of getting rid of that person. It was done in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and I think it's still being intimidation.
Do you think there's a distaste for unions these days?
Somewhat, because when they show in the paper that an auto worker is making $40 an hour, and they're counting everything under the sun, that's not his wages, but people look at that, and you skim the paper and you believe it. It's in a paper. I believe it. They're making that kind of money. It's not really true. I think I made $25,000 was the most I made until I went into supervision. All of a sudden they gave me a 30% raise or 40% raise to take supervisor's job.
So in retrospect, your time at the mill, how do you feel that the union served its members and served the industry?
I think here in Lackawanna and internationally, they did well as they could under the circumstances. Could have done better. Things I didn't like about it. It was well structured. Here in Lackawanna, they had 4 major locals. They're the big mill locals and us and the fire department. So those were the locals. The TAP committee they call it the TAP committee, used to meet every Monday right here at the Union Hall and then later on at the hotel in McKinley. But we'd meet every Monday, and it would be the chief grievanceman and the president. That's the representatives of each local. And the way the bylaws were, the chief grievanceman had to be the officers of the TAP committee. So you had a fellow by the name of Dick Corcoran, who was the chief grievanceman at the Coke Ovens, went on to a long career in the international. He was the chairman. I got elected as treasurer and recording secretary of it. So I took the notes and did all that kind of thing. And we meet, and it was good. The interplay between, a lot of times there'd be fights. There was almost a couple fist fights between the presidents, because it's the kind of personalities you have. You cheap, back and forth, they're going to punch you and all that. But it was good. We always presented a united front with the company. We met on Monday mornings. Monday afternoon, we'd meet with the general manager at the time, Fred Daggett. And he was a hard-nosed man. He was... They go around the table and what are the problems? At that time is when they were talking about the galvanized mill they're shutting down steelmaking in '82. The galvanized mill would get coils in from Burns Harbor, process them. The bar mill would get them from Johnstown. And he said, and realistically, the galvanized will probably last 5 years tops and the bar mill 2 years. Well, galvanized is still going. Because of the workforce, because actually working together more than the fights. And that's why I say that when they offered me the supervisor's job, the fights were over, basically. There were nickel and dime fights, nothing important anymore, and I was frankly getting bored. I was going to resign the union job anyway and take a break, and then this came up, and I went into supervision for 12 years. So that was okay.
Got to ask you, if you had the chance, would you go back and do it all over again?
Nobody ever asked me that.
It's a tough question.
I suppose. I like the part, without getting too detailed, I settled a lot of grievances for a lot of money for people, and I got Christmas cards. When these people were out of work for 2 years, I got them vacation pay, finagle that a little bit. That's a funny story, but I'm tying you up too much, I think. What happened was they were shutting down our payroll department. And we went to the labor board. And we said, they can't do that. They're transferring the payroll. It's still a payroll, but they're transferring it to Burns Harbor. they were going to lay off every person in payroll. So we go to the NLRB. I quick put a grievance in, quick withdrew it, went to the NLRB. They put an injunction on the company to stop from moving payroll. Now, we knew they could move it. We looked up the Pike and Fishers and all these things where for monetary reasons, they're still going to have people work, albeit non-union people. But those people end up organizing anyway afterwards. But they were going to move it. Well, they said, oh, geez, you know, what could we do? What do you want? So you would allow us to move the payroll, which I know they're going to move it anyway. We had a vacation grievance in. This may sound crazy. When you're laid off from the steel plant and a clerical, you got 2 years of vacation. So, because you have 2 years of recall. Well, I read the contract forward and backwards where you could have up to 5 years of recall. So I put a grievance in on behalf, I had people sign it other than myself, that they should have 5 years of vacation. And that's what the company gave us. $200,000 vacation for all these people that were out of work for 4 years, severed in some cases. I said, I don't care if they severed or they stayed on the rolls. They had that vacation coming. If you'd have told them they had the vacation coming, they wouldn't have severed. That's a convoluted argument. But it worked, and they gave us that to let them move payroll, which they were going to do anyway. So, and I get Christmas cards saying, thanks a lot. So
you helped a lot of people out.
Yeah.
I mean, your time there wasn't just for you to make a living and do things. You were actively involved in making people's lives better, taking care of them when you could, and helping out when times got bad. Well,
the thing was, the first time I ran, it still wasn't an issue, super seniority. Super seniority means you can't get laid off. Actually, in all the unions, the chief grievance man is number one, the president's number two. He's the last guy to leave because he has to fight for all the remaining workers. The president can sign checks anyway. So they can't get laid off. So it was no issue the first time I ran, the second time I ran. And I ran against a fellow named Brian Williams from accounting, and his department was twice the size of my department. But I give it to the fact that I was up front with the people at meetings and told them what was happening with their grievances. Like it or not, this is what happened. I explained it to them. That I kind of won those people over. And the third and fourth time, I ran unopposed. And the fellow that I ran against, one of my best friends for president, backed me. I'm backing the president, he's backing me. So it's kind of a fellow by the name of Bill Grant, ended up working at the IRS. But it was interesting. It'd break your heart sometimes, but overall.
And you don't need to name names, obviously, and you don't have to get too far into it, but in your position, do you ever feel like someone was trying to unduly influence you to go one way or another on issues, whether they were inside the plant or outside the plant?
Yeah, there were those times. There were those times, and you just kind of say, get away from me, shrug it off. Now I can tell you this story. I'm trying to talk about integrity or whatever, but like I said, I was the treasurer of the top committee, and each local put in a fund. There's thousands of dollars in there. I had to write checks for if somebody had to take a trip or something. I had to okay it. Well, we used to go to lunch at the Mansard Inn, and it bothered me somewhat that these presidents and grievance men were taking advantage for lunch, having a lobster, having a prime rib. I said, have a hamburger, but okay. When they ordered two of them, and I said, I'm not signing the checks, I resigned that job. I said, no. People are losing their jobs, and you guys are eating two lobsters, taking one home? No. So and that goes back to my thoughts about some of those presidents sleeping 4 to a room to make money on a trip. I didn't like it. And we went to Atlantic City for a meeting. They called it a pre-contract meeting with the company. Union had to pay their own freight down there and so forth, but the company would take you to dinner and wine and dine you. Me and the president of our local would never go.
Sure, they're trying to influence you.
Absolutely. Well, that's your question, yeah.
That's a good point. I mean, how was your relationship with the corporate guys? I mean, was it us against them, or was it we need to sit down and it was congenial, but we're going to work this thing out? With
the older crew, the Jim McMahons and that, it was congenial. He never gave away the store. He would explain to you. He had some authority. When the new crew came in, I would talk basketball with one fellow's from Indiana. I mean, congenial up to a point, but they had no power much to do anything, and I had some disdain for that. And I try to sit at the table and not frown or anything because I know it's a waste of time, absolute waste of time. It's going higher up, higher up. The problem was I was involved with a grievance from step 2, 3, 4, pre-ARB, ARB, grievance review in Washington, D.C. We'd have to go down there and meet with the company hierarchy. These other fellows say no, 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 and they're done with it. I had to follow it all the way through to the end. So I had intimate knowledge. I'll tell you, I'm not going to tie you up, but
now you have all the time.
One of the funniest stories in the world. My first grievance review ever. I was a rookie, and I'm with Joe Lippick. I'm a grievance chairman. They had a place, they had an office, Bethlehem did, about 3 blocks from the White House, in the solar building, I think it was. Yeah, solar building, maybe 2 blocks. And that's where their lobbyist was, and so they'd go down there for grievance reviews. You'd bring a stack of grievances, the company'd have them. So we go in to meet with them, and they had a green board. It was all blank. And we go in, and they flip it over, and it must have had 100 grievances, little numbers, WD for withdrawal, $100, this, all these different payments. They want you to give up this one for that one, which was anathema to me. I'd never give away your grievance for his. You got a good one, he's got a good one, we're fighting them both. If not, I'm not trading grievances. So they got this whole board. It must have taken them 2 hours. So they leave. He says, spend an hour or two, whatever you need to digest it. 3 of us are sitting there. I took the eraser. I didn't even read it. I erased the whole board. We sat there. We played. I always bring a deck of cards. We're playing euchre. They come back. Are you ready yet? Yeah, we're ready. I had it flipped over. I flipped it back. It's all gone. They were fuming at me. I pulled out my stack. I said, come on, one by one. Let's go. So let's do some work. They were mad at me. And
they thought they could just be done in 15 minutes. Huh?
Yeah, they kind of knew after that what they're dealing with. I mean, I'd be as fair as I can be, but certain things. I mean, we represented the cafeteria workers, and who were they? They had one cafeteria that the main office worked at, and the cafeteria at the superintendent's dining room, which was, you have some of the artifacts here from their plates and so forth. And they forced those women, I find this out after I take over the top job, they forced them to wear white, just like a nurse's outfit, with white stockings and white shoes and all that. And they gave them a stipend of $20 a year. So the steward there, Mary Reformat, says to me, she says, can you get us like a $5 or $10 raise? I said, yeah, I'll try. I know I can get that. We're sitting down at the pre-negotiations, all the top union officials, all the top company. It's my turn to be first because they figure we don't have as many, and we're not trying to get people hired back that have been fired for stabbing somebody or crazy stuff in the mill, killing people. He got fired because he killed a guy, spent 10 years, we want him back. Those things happen. So I said, you want these women to wear these outfits. I want you to pay for those outfits. I want you to supply the shoes. They'll go to any store you want. Oh, you know what that would cost? I said, yeah, what it cost them. That's what it would cost. And they said, no. I says, well, then they don't have to wear any of those clothes. Who says they have to wear them? Let them wear their street clothes. They'll look fine, you know. No. So the head of our negotiator, Dick Corcoran at the time, takes me in the hall. You going to hold this whole thing up for 4 women? I said, yep. He says, let me take the company out. Because I had the right to talk forever. Takes the company out to come back. We'll supply the outfits. We'll give you the money. We'll give you this. I said, you know, you got to wash them every day. Kid, shut up, O'Shei. Those women, I had all their votes locked up. I had all the janitors.
So you were doing a good job for the folks you represented?
Yeah, that I enjoyed. It was an easy thing. It wasn't there were many people that got fired I had to get back. Some of those were tough. But
let me ask you another question. This is, again, sort of an after-the-fact thing, but if the plant was still going today, is it someplace you'd want your boys to go work in?
Absolutely not. When they were hiring, they had big, long lines, and I could have circumvented the lines. The head of labor relations, Samsel, asked me if So you got a couple sons? I said, yeah, and they're not coming here. I said, nope. My wife's number one thing was education with them, and so they got good jobs. They're doing well.
All right, well, thank you, Tim. Tim O'Shei.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, that was a pleasure. Yeah.